Hello, hello, hello. Hi, everyone. We are going to get started in just a minute. Hope everyone is doing well on this beautiful, warm Southern California day. I think in the San Fernando Valley today, it's supposed to be over 90 degrees. I think it's at least in its 80s here. So the weather is changing. There is hope in the air. Okay. Time to get started. As usual, just to review the Zoom platform for those of you who are participating today. Thank you, number one, for showing up. I really appreciate it. You will notice that on the bottom of your screen, you have the option for asking a question either through the Q&A little button that you see at the bottom. In the middle of your screen on the bottom, there is a Q&A section. So feel free, as we're going through this learning, if you have a question that you want to ask, feel free to write it there, or you can chat to me, or you can raise your hand. So lots of options, and especially with this story, because there are a lot of different ways to interpret it, like pretty much every story. I'd love to hear your thoughts after we go through the story. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it and your interpretations, because mine is just one of many. Okay, let's get started. A great story here. So we'll start with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us this opportunity to engage in the study of Torah. All right, hopefully you have the source sheet. If you don't, I'm going to be putting it on the screen and sharing it with you so that you'll be able to read along as we go through this. All of the resources for this session, as well as previous sessions and other people's learning sessions that have been taking place through our Wilshire Boulevard Temple at Home, WBT at Home, new way of engaging with the community, all of that can be found on our website under wbtla.org/WBTAT home. Okay, WBT at home. And on the left side of that, you'll see study at home and resources, and you can click there and get all the previous sessions and all the source sheets. Okay, we're going to begin. As I do with these, we will start by reading through the whole story all the way through, and then we'll go back and break it down. One thing for this story to be aware of, there is a lot of the use of the word he, the pronoun he, and sometimes it's not clear who is speaking or who it's referring to. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts of the story, is that because it's just pronouns and there's not a lot of personal names used, it leaves a lot of things up for interpretation. All right, let's get started. Here we go. The ugly man. That's of course not the way it's titled in the Talmud, because there are no titles in the Talmud for the stories, but this is the popular one. Comes from the Babylonian Talmud, Ta'anit 21a. Okay, our rabbis have taught on Tanaite authority. A person should always be as yielding as a reed and never as unyielding as a cedar. Now this whole story is going to explain that. There is the case of Rabbi Simeon or Shimon ben Elazar, who was coming from the house of his master in Migdal Gador, riding on an ass and making his way along the riverbank. He was in a very happy frame of mind and feeling good about himself because he had learned a great deal of Torah. An unusually ugly man came along. He said to him, "Peace be to you, my lord." But he did not reply to him. Then he said, "Empty head, what a beast! How ugly you are! Is it possible that everyone in your town is as ugly as you are?" He said to him, "I really couldn't say, but go to the craftsman who made me and tell him how ugly is that utensil that you have made." When Rabbi Simon ben Elazar realized that he had sinned, he got off his ass and prostrated himself before the man, saying to him, "I beg you to forgive me." He said to him, "I shall not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me and tell him how ugly is that utensil that you have made." He ran after the man for 3 miles until he came to his town. The people of the town came out to meet him. They said toward him, "Peace be to you, my lord, my lord, my teacher, my teacher." He said to them, "Whom do you call my lord, my lord?" They said to him, to the one who is going along after you. He said to them, if this is of my Lord, may there not be many more like him in Israel. They said to him, God forbid. And what has he done to you? He said to them, thus and so did he do to me. They said to him, nonetheless, forgive him, for he is a man who is great in Torah learning. He said to them, lo, for your sake I forgive him, on the condition that he not make a habit of acting in that way. On that same day, Rabbi Simeon entered the great study house that was his and gave an exposition. A person should always be as yielding as a reed and never as unyielding as a cedar. Okay, that's the story. So now we're going to go back and break it down. We have three characters in this story, actually. We have the rabbi, we have the ugly man, and we have the community. Okay, those are the three characters. So as we're going through, I want you to be thinking about, what do you think of each of these characters, how they act, how they respond to one another? Did they make any mistakes along the way? Then I also want you to be thinking about, what is this trying to teach us, of course, and how is this relevant to our lives today? And also, who's at fault in this story? Who really is at fault? Is it anyone in particular? Is it everyone? So lots of different ways of interpreting this. Okay, so now let's go back and we're going to break it down piece by piece, and then we're going to open it up for you all to add your own interpretations and questions, because I think especially with this one, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, so we're going to go back to the story, to the very beginning. All right, so the main part, this whole story is supposed to illustrate the teaching that a person should always be as yielding, meaning as flexible as a reed, which you find, in marshes, and never as unyielding as a cedar, right? Cedar, a very strong type of wood that doesn't bend very often. So a person should be as flexible as a reed and never as unyielding as a cedar. And that's the framework and the lesson that we are supposed to hear from this story. And this is exactly the phrase that is offered by the rabbi at the end of the story. Okay, so we have this rabbi who was coming from the house of his master in this town, riding on an ass and making his way along the riverbank. And he's very, very happy frame of mind and feeling good about himself because he had learned a great deal of Torah. So here's someone who is in a place of feeling very secure with himself, feeling on top of the world, feeling like he just learned a ton. His endorphins and his adrenaline are going strong. He's feeling great. He's on top of the world, and literally he is raised above the ground on his donkey, making his way back from his teacher's house of study, just feeling great. Okay, so this is not someone who's coming into the story feeling depressed or feeling like he already wants to lash out at people. Okay, we're already setting the stage that this is someone in a good place psychologically, so we would assume. And he's along the riverbank, okay? And he's in a happy frame of mind. An unusually ugly man came along. Now, for a minute, I want you to imagine, what does that person look like? What is the definition of ugly here? Because right now, we don't actually have a description of this person other than it is an unusually ugly man. Okay, now I think this is the first place in the story that we are left with a variety of different interpretations. And depending on where you are today, and depending on where you are next time you read this, you can read this in a variety of ways. Right now, we are already being presented with, I believe, two types of ugliness. Is this man physically ugly, or is this person psychologically and emotionally ugly? We do not know at this point. The assumption would be from an initial reading that this is probably someone who is physically ugly, but I want you to keep in mind that one of the beauties of this story that draws me to it is this idea that ugliness, which we tend to perceive as purely a physical attribute, is clearly, and we know this, we just don't think about it as much as physical ugliness, that there is an emotional and psychological ugliness that exists within people that may not be seen on the outside, but that may still be there underneath the surface. Okay, so we have an ugly man, an unusual ugly man. Here is the rabbi. He's coming along. He's in a great mood. He's feeling really secure and proud of himself. And he comes across this unusually ugly man. He said to him, another question, another thing that's put up to interpretation. Who is speaking to whom here? He said to him, "Peace be to you, my lord," but he did not reply to him. Now, we have two ways of reading this. Is this the ugly man saying to the rabbi, "Peace be to you, my lord," and the rabbi doesn't respond because the rabbi is feeling so good and feeling so above and high and elevated on himself and physically elevated that this ugly guy, however we want to define that, is nothing to him. So why would he spend his time talking to this ugly man? Or is it that the rabbi is saying this to the ugly man and the ugly man doesn't respond, that the rabbi, who is in this place of feeling very secure and very good about himself, says, "Peace be to you, my lord," in some way, giving this person who is ugly a title such as my lord, meaning someone with reverence, with respect. And is this the rabbi speaking to the ugly man and saying, "Hello, nice to see you. I'm feeling good, so I'm willing to talk to anyone," but then the ugly man doesn't reply to him? That's up to you to interpret. Okay, so we have two options here. Now, then he said to him, we still don't know who is speaking to whom, but one of them says to the other, "Empty head, what a beast, how ugly you are. Is it possible that everyone in your town is as ugly as you are?" Okay, this is a serious cut down to whoever is speaking, whoever is receiving this comment, right? Basically saying, you are an ugly person. Do you come from a town of ugly looking people? Is everyone as ugly as you are? Now, we're still in this place of interpretation. On initial read, you might believe that, of course, this is now the rabbi speaking. And the rabbi is saying how ugly you are because maybe he's upset that the man didn't respond to him in the statement before. And he's saying, well, is everyone as ugly as you are? So this is the rabbi lashing out at the ugly man for not responding, for not being aware of the fact that here's a rabbi who's speaking to him, and how dare he not respond? He's not going to respond to me. I'm going to cut him down with a really cruel attack. Or it could be read potentially, is this the ugly man saying to the rabbi? We don't know. Okay. Regardless, he said to him, "I really couldn't say, but go to the craftsman who made me and tell him how ugly is that utensil that you have made." So now we can start to figure out who's speaking more directly. Most likely, this is the ugly man speaking to the rabbi and saying, "I don't know, but why don't you go to the craftsman?" Now, the craftsman in this case is, of course, God. Go to God who made me and tell him how ugly is that utensil you've made. How ugly is that vessel that you've created? In other words, you want to call me ugly? Well, and you're a rabbi, and I probably know that as this person on the road because you are someone who's well known. It's not like people are coming from so far away. People tend to know who the big shots are in the towns near them, in the villages near them. You want to call me ugly? How about you go to God and ask God why God made me? In other words, using religion and using theology and using God to support his claim that if you want to attack me and say something that disrespectful, well, why don't I use your view of the world against you and tell you, no, you go out and ask God. Now, when the rabbi realized that he had sinned, that he had done something wrong, he got off of his donkey. He's now getting low. He even gets even lower and prostrates himself before the man and says, "I beg you to forgive me." Okay, so this is the first example of asking for forgiveness, right? Of tshuva, of asking the ugly man, the man, "Please forgive me. I realize I did something wrong. I'm really begging you. I'm literally getting down on my hands and knees, asking you to forgive me because I realize I did something wrong." Is that a valid way to ask for an apology, given what he had said and how he had disrespected the ugly man? That's up to you. Some may say that, yes, that's absolutely a valid, once you realize you've done something wrong, go ahead and just ask to be forgiven and prostrate yourself. Others may say that's not good enough. I mean, he's not doing enough. He called this man such a derogatory name and really put him in the context of being not just ugly and showing his flaws, but linking him to a whole community of people who are flawed and saying that he is as ugly as can be. No, the rabbi should do more than this. Okay, you can go either way. But let's see what the ugly man says in return. He said to him, I shall not forgive you until you go to the craftsman who made me and tell him, how ugly is that utensil you have made? So the response, when the rabbi says, please, I beg you to forgive me, the ugly man says, as soon as you go to God and you tell him how ugly is that utensil you've made, then I'll forgive you. In other words, I'm not going to forgive you because, of course, it's impossible for the rabbi to go to God and say to God, yeah, look at what you created, because the rabbi, of course, would never do that. So now the ugly man's response is, no, I'm not willing to forgive you. Now the question is that valid? Is it appropriate for this man to not forgive the rabbi and to decide that there is a line that has been crossed? We don't know this ugly man's past. Maybe this is someone who has been called ugly his entire life and has been dealing with that. And this is now someone someone with status who is coming to him and saying, you are ugly. The one person who is supposed to be the leader of the community and who is supposed to support everyone and is supposed to believe that we are all made in the image of God. If that person is going to come to me and call me ugly, there's no way in hell I'm going to forgive him, let alone I'd forgive anyone else. So now we have another layer. Is he not forgiving him because the rabbi is someone of status and of leadership? And that when you are in a position of leadership or status, what you say has an impact that may be more than you even realize. And that in this case, the rabbi crossed the line because you can't ever leave your position, right? This is something that we talked about in rabbinical school, this idea that you have to realize that when you are a rabbi, when you have that title, there are certain things that come along with that. There is a certain lifestyle, there is a certain way in which people are going to perceive you, and that's the reality. And that's the case for all kinds of leaders. It's of course not just for rabbis. Anyone who feels that they are, or who has a title in which they are put in a position of leadership, maybe this is a reminder that you can never really leave that position, and you are going to be perceived based on your status, and what you say matters. Now, of course, we know what we say matters, but I think here there may be another level in terms of a teaching for those of us who are in a position of leadership in whatever position that may be. Okay, or you can read this as, well, how can he not forgive this man? I mean, the rabbi asked for forgiveness, and this is inappropriate. I mean, you have to at some point accept forgiveness and give forgiveness to someone if they are asking for it. Okay, well, let's see what keeps going on. Now I think in the story, we're starting to blend what ugliness is. Is it physical? Or now I think it's becoming more psychological and emotional, the ugliness that's coming out in the story. So he ran after the man for 3 miles until he came to his town. We can assume this is the rabbi now who prostrated himself to this man, running after this man for the next 3 miles, begging him for forgiveness, or at least basically being behind him and allowing this man to have some reverence. And the people of the town come out to meet him. Come out to meet whom? We would assume coming out to meet their rabbi, who's now back from studying at his teacher's yeshiva. And they said towards him, peace be to you, my Lord, my teacher, my teacher. So they're welcoming back their teacher and saying, it's wonderful to see you. And the man said to them, whom do you call my Lord? In other words, now the ugly man's saying, who are you talking to? Are you talking to me? Or are you talking to this guy who shouldn't be called my Lord at all? They said to him, to the one who is going along after you, of course. He's our teacher. He's one of us. And he said to them, if this is my Lord, if this is a teacher, may there not be more like him in Israel. Now the ugly man's taking it to the next level, right? It was one thing when they were just on the road to the two of them, and he wasn't willing to forgive the rabbi. And now we're in front of the whole town. We're in front of this leader's community, And this man is coming out and saying, if this is what you call a leader, then you better not be, there shouldn't be any like him in this town, because, or any more like him, because he is not a leader. Now, this you could read either way, right? Again, is this an example of someone saying, you need to be aware of what your leaders are doing behind the scenes, and you have a responsibility. In other words, the ugly man has a responsibility to shed light on the failures or the challenges that come with the leader of the community? Or is this inappropriate for him based on what happened when the two of them were alone to now, air this dirty laundry in front of the whole community? You can read it both ways. I think I saw a hand up, so I'm going to take a break unless I'm totally wrong here. Yes, there is a hand up. Okay, yes, Sukasa, you had a question? Go ahead.
Okay, I mute. Okay. Well, I think two things. One, I think the rabbi had initial feeling of self-importance because he was studying Torah, when it should make him humble, my opinion. The other thing is that the third commandment says, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. And he did, because you have to figure that the ugly man, all human beings are, I believe, made in the image of God. And so he was being blasphemous to God. And that's why the ugly man said, okay, well, you prostrated yourself to me, but you have sinned against God. What have you done about that?
Okay, good. I like those interpretations. Good. Let's keep reading, because let's see how, if at all, if your views on the characters change as we continue through the story. But yes,
okay,
good. Okay, let's go back to sharing the screen. Okay. He said to him, if this is my Lord, there may not be more like him in Israel. In other words, this is not someone who should be called a leader. And the townspeople said to him, God forbid, what has he done to you? Oh my God. I mean, here's this guy saying about the rabbi of their community in front of everyone and in front of the rabbi that this person is not legitimate to be their rabbi. I mean, that's a huge thing to be saying in front of an entire group, to basically say, you should disavow yourself of this man. He isn't your leader. You should know better. And so now they're curious. Oh my God, what happened? And then the man proceeds to tell them what happened on the road, and their interchange. Now, we don't know exactly how he retold that story, and the rabbi doesn't tell his side of the story. So we don't know what happens. And in terms of, this is, I think, a really important point, that when we retell a story, we of course are telling it through our lens, in our view. So we don't really know what he says, but we can assume it's not positive. And they say to him, the community still says, nonetheless, regardless of what he did, forgive him, for he is a man who is great in Torah learning. Again, two ways of reading this. One, we can read this as, look, he made a mistake, yes, but overall, he's a great scholar. He's someone who's been leading our community, and you should forgive him because of that position and because of all the other things that he does, which are really positive and really important for our community. So yes, he made a mistake by doing this and being disrespectful to you, but please forgive him. Or you can read this as, well, the community just doesn't want to deal with the fact that they have someone who is their leader, who is, if he's doing this with this man, maybe he's saying other things behind closed doors that are disrespectful or blasphemous. And therefore, this is them saying, well, someone who is in a position of power or leadership gets a pass, so to speak, in certain ways. And therefore, when they make a little mistake here or there, let's not worry about that so much, because there is a person who has gained this position for a reason, and we should allow him to be in that position. Now, so as you're reading this, these two different ways of which we can interpret the story are really a way, I think, about how we look at ugliness in the world, and how we look for beauty and how we look for ugliness. And I'm not talking, of course, about physical ugliness and beauty. I'm talking about the psychological and the emotional. Like how do you read what is happening here, and where do you put your trust? And where do you start to feel anger? And are you siding more with the ugly man? Are you siding more with the community and the rabbi? I think it says a lot about where we are individually, depending on how we read this story. And it can change depending on how we're feeling during that day or our own relationships. But I think that's one of the brilliant parts of this story. Okay, we're almost at the end. He said to them, "Lo, for your sake I forgive him, on the condition that he not make a habit of acting that way." Okay, you know what, says the ugly man, I'll forgive him, but I'm only going to forgive him because of you, and only on the condition that he doesn't do this again. Okay, so really now the ugly man is really taking a position of authority and power and saying, okay, I will do this for you and only in this condition, but I really still am not really convinced that this man should be forgiven. But for the benefit and for the sake of the greater community and for the fabric of this community, in order to stay together so that your leader isn't put in this position of shame by me as ugly man, I'm gonna forgive him. Okay, and then on that same day, the rabbi goes into his yeshiva and he gives an exposition. He says, a person should always be as yielding as a reed and never as unyielding as a cedar. Now, is he referring to himself? Is he saying that a person should always be as flexible as possible? I was flexible enough to say that, I asked for forgiveness. I was willing to walk behind him and I let the community decide. And you shouldn't be as unyielding as a cedar. Is that him saying, well, you shouldn't be like the ugly man, and that's what makes him ugly, is that he was unyielding? But maybe he was yielding. So maybe is this saying, well, you should be like the ugly man, and you should be someone who is willing to bend and be flexible and never be so narrow in your belief that you are unwilling to forgive regardless, because in this case, the ugly man was willing to forgive. Or is this about the community? Is this a statement about what it means to be in a community and how they are supposed to understand their leaders? That they should see that their leaders are going to make mistakes, and therefore they should give a little bit of flexibility to their leaders because everyone makes mistakes, and they shouldn't be so harsh that they are unwilling to give a little bit of leeway even to their leaders who are held up in a certain light, unlike everyone else in the community. So that's, I think, a ton going on in the story. And that's what I love about it is, and I feel like all of it is true, right? I don't necessarily think there's just one angle that this story is trying to teach us, but I think it is such a great story about ugliness and about when do we yield? And this, I think, goes along with the story that we had spent the last 2 weeks studying, the Oven of Achnai, about a community of rabbis who was unwilling to yield when the rabbi brought all the arguments in heaven and even had a heavenly voice come. They were unwilling to yield. And as a result, at the end of the story in part 2, which we read, of course, it leads to the death of the head of the Sanhedrin and the excommunication of that rabbi. And at the end of the day, everyone's kind of lost, right? That was pretty unyielding in that sense. So I'm curious, what do people think here? Who's at fault? What lesson are we supposed to learn from this? How do you feel that this connects to what we're going through either individually or collectively today? I see Cindy has some thoughts. Cindy, yes, please. Hi.
I think that the Torah's commandments and rules are kind of the recipe for how to behave. So the learned rabbi learned the intellectual part of Torah, but missed what the Torah is really trying to do, which is to make a better community. So I think that he was saying that rules and are rigid, and which is what a cedar is, but interpreting Torah with humanity is the reed part. And so that is why he insisted that God had to forgive him rather than the ugly man, because the rabbi was a leader of people, and if he doesn't understand what the lessons are, what good is it?
So you're saying that the rabbi, the statement of be as flexible as a reed, but not as unyielding as a cedar is really the rabbi's interpretation of the Torah, and that even though the Torah laws are firm, that we need to be flexible in how we interpret them.
Yes.
Okay.
And you need that the Torah is meant to be a humane body of work. It's not meant to be an inflexible body of work.
Great. So that when the rabbi made a mistake and went against the Torah laws by the way he treated this ugly man, instead of him being never being forgiven for that, that there is flexibility built into the laws of the Torah in terms of how we are supposed to, how we can respond to them or be treated. Okay.
Well, that the Torah is not meant to just be laws, that by just knowing the intellectual part, you're missing the whole point.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And Marnie. Hi. Marnie, you can talk now. I saw your hand was up. If you want to
I have to unmute
something.
myself. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So I think what I got out of this is that the thing that the rabbi says is really horrific, and it's cut and dry, like how horrible it is. And that it's so easy to rationalize why you wouldn't forgive, because that's pretty cut, there's no other way to look at it. You can't like find the silver lining in what he said, but that the true sort of lesson is to be like loving and forgiving, even when the other person is wrong. Like, it's not about being right. It's about unarmoring self to find forgiveness for yourself, for the community, for the other person. So that's sort of been going on in my own life. So that's how I've kind of reading it, is, to be unarmoring is to be loving even when someone hurts you.
Nice. Now, did you believe in that view? Do you believe that the person who's deemed the ugly man does that? Does he learn that lesson in the story?
I feel like he does, because then my interpretation of that last piece is that he has made a mistake. And so a true leader, he goes in front of his community and he says, this is what I've learned, is, I'm human. I made this mistake and someone forgave me. And so that's a lesson that I learned in my life, and I want to pay it forward, so to speak.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Let's see. Sukasa.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I think one of the tenets of Reform Judaism is that it's more important how we act to be righteous rather than the words, than studying and being a scholar. And it seems that the ugly man was more righteous in that with the community, they forgave the rabbi. But I go back to the fact that the rabbi, just because he's a Torah scholar, the community may give him homage and so forth, but he didn't act as a righteous man, and he never made amends to God.
Okay, so the rabbi's mistake here is that he didn't go and ask for forgiveness from God. He went to the ugly man to ask for forgiveness, but that wasn't good enough. That he needed to go to God. Okay. Though my question is, what does that look like, especially in the way in which we understand tshuva, at least around Yom Kippur? Of course, on Yom Kippur we do ask for forgiveness from God, but the majority of the work that we do around tshuva in our tradition is when we have to ask for forgiveness from other people, right? So
that's true.
We could also read this as he attempted to ask for forgiveness from this man, and I go back to the fact that I think maybe one of the things that makes this man ugly is his unwillingness to bend like the reed, because he's the one who doesn't forgive, and only at the very end, when the community pressures him, does he actually forgive the man, and it's kind of not really a full forgiveness. So that's another, when we go back to where does ugliness lie in this story, of course there is the ugliness that comes from the rabbi's words, but I think there's also an ugliness in the man, in his actions. All right, so thank you. I see a few more hands here. Merle. Hi, Merle.
So I'm looking at this. Yes, we have to, excuse me, we have to look at Torah and Talmud and say, and what you learn in whatever seminary you're coming from, what you learn and what you should do. But I also think in this particular situation, you have to look at the personalities of the individuals and whether those personalities can be changed in any way, or whether they're capable of changing their personalities in any way in order to forgive, etc.
Okay, good. How does that play out in the story?
That I think that in this case, he gave in and he forgave. But
Okay.
that I don't know that that's going to happen in every situation, depending on a person's personality, whether they're the ugly person and how they are about themselves, or whether they're the rabbi and his personality, and how to, how is he, how are they not, how are they perceived in the community? Are they just, should you just forget, should they just give in and forgive in whatever the situation is, or is the community saying he's not capable of forgiving, depending on who it is? It can go either way.
Yeah, it can. You're right. Personality does come into a factor, and especially, obviously that plays more into the situation when you have a relationship with the person with whom you've hurt. In this case, they don't really know each other.
We don't know.
We don't really know. You're right. We don't really know. You also brought up a thing about, you said something in passing kind of about ugliness and whether it was how he was ugly. It's also, I think, interesting. Another lens to this is perception of ugliness. Was this self-described ugliness, or is this an outwardly perceived ugliness, right? Because there is a way in which many people see themselves as ugly or do ugly things. And there's the other, which is how we are perceived by others are ugly in our actions or in our physicality.
I think it's all a perception.
Okay, great.
And it's not just because you're appointed or hired or whatever the position is as a leader, you may come in there with one personality, but that may, it's like an interview. You can say what you're going to say in an interview. Is that really how you perceive yourself or how you behave?
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, Susan. Hi, Susan.
Okay, am I muted?
Nope, I can hear you.
Okay, I think this is a great story. And I couldn't help laughing in the beginning when the rabbi speaks to this fellow on the road and says, "You were really ugly." I mean, why would anyone do that, especially a rabbi? I'll come to that in a minute, but he's on his high horse, feeling good about himself. And then he's learned all this Torah, and then all of a sudden he sees this man and then he demeans him. And one of the things in the Torah is that words are important. It's important what you say. Not only does he say something awful, but he puts this guy down so much. And I thought there was humor in it, that you're so ugly that one is taken aback. And then, of course, their dialogue too, with an empty head, how ugly you are. So I think, but I liked your interpretation to try and figure out who was the speaker. I thought that was, that caused me to be taken aback, and whether it's an ugly personality. But how would the rabbi see an ugly personality? What would probably strike him as his face. And
yeah,
yes,
that's true.
Okay,
that's it.
But in terms of forgiveness, the rabbi did, he prostrated himself after being high on his horse. So there's a difference between being upright, but she wasn't. He was just high on a horse and then falling on his face. but to deliberately hurt another person, it's also in the Torah that when we shame a person, it's like the blood rushes to their head. It's like killing them. And I mean, certainly in public, this wasn't in public, but nonetheless. I loved your interpretation that rabbis should be above others, not above others, be a model, and it's important how they act. And he acted horribly.
Yeah, yeah, he did. And I think what you bring up about the high horse, I think there's also a lesson here to be saying that people can lash out not just when they're in the depths of despair and when they're feeling angry. That this is a lesson to all of us, that you need to be aware of yourself all the time, not just when you're feeling dark and in despair, where you may be more prone to lash out to people and you need to subdue yourself in those situations. But even in those moments where you are feeling great, the rabbis seem to be saying even more so, you need to be aware of yourself, because when you are in a place of safety, that's when you can make mistakes and say things that are extremely destructive. So I think that's another lesson that I think is brought up through here. Thank you, Susan. Really appreciate it. Okay, I saw that Sydney, who is my mom, had a thought that she chatted. So why don't you just say it out loud so we can hear your interpretation? Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Mom.
Hi, Joel. So really interesting teaching, and it seems, the note that I wrote was, it seems as if none of the characters is really changed for the long term by this experience. In fact, as we're reading this and I'm hearing the comments and you're teaching about it, yes, they are in the situation where they're saying, I'm sorry, one should be flexible. So the rabbi's teaching at the end, both the bookend of both the beginning and the end, tells us that we should be flexible, but that we should also be strong. And yet the community takes him back. He does the teaching. We don't know that he would never do this kind of thing again. And we don't know that the ugly man has changed his perspective, other than to say, for the sake of someone else, as you point out, I will forgive you. So really, the question is, how does the community hold a standard for changed behavior when there's not evidence that it's going to stick?
That's a great question, and you're right. We don't have a sense of what that standard is in the story. In the story, if anything, we get a negative standard, which is title, and title alone is a standard that bears bears the ability for someone to be forgiven. So we don't actually. It's not like the ugly man is the one who says, okay, my standard is I'll forgive him as long as he doesn't do X. But the community doesn't hold the rabbi to that standard necessarily. We don't know. And the rabbi, we're not sure if the rabbi is holding himself to that standard. We can't really tell, though he is teaching a lesson about it, but we're not really clear who's which character in what he's teaching. And the ugly man, right, also, it's not really clear if he's really learned and changed. So I think you're bringing up a really good point about the story. The story as a warning to all three characters, you as the individual, the people with whom you interact, and you may say things to that may be destructive, whether you mean it or not, right? We can imagine that the rabbi was kind of in this zone and he said something without really thinking. And is that an excuse? No, but yourself, a warning to you, to those with whom you interact, and to those who are on the receiving end of destructive words, and then a warning to the entire community that this is a pattern that could continue, right? There's no guarantee at the end of this story that all of them have learned a lesson and this is not going to happen again. So I think it is a warning about what ugliness can look like. So thank you. Thanks, Mom. Okay, I see Sukasa, I think, had her hand up one more time. Go ahead.
I didn't. I made a mistake.
Oh, okay. We forgive you.
Oh, good. Does the community forgive me?
Yes. Okay. So thank you for that. And I can't tell if Susan, did you have your hand up again, or was that also just up from before?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't have my hand up, but I
Okay.
love this story. And I think the rabbi learned, hopefully he learned, because he gave a sermon on that, on the story, and what he went through might also suggest that he was learning.
Good. Yes. Yeah. Right. The fact that he is willing to talk about this with his community and teach it as a lesson is a really good sign. I think this is a great story. I actually used this. We did a community-wide learning right before the high holidays with a variety of synagogues in the area, and this is the story I brought for my session because I think it's a great story for us to think about all year round. But I think especially as we get closer, as we alluded to earlier in the conversation, as we get closer to the high holidays, and the idea of tshuva, and in that moment where we are thinking about ugliness, our own ugliness, and the ugliness of the world around us, I think this is a really good story for us to continue to revisit. So I want to leave it there, and I hope you continue to struggle with this story in all the beautiful ways that you can. And just a reminder of what ugliness can look like, that the ugliness of this ugly man is really probably not at all physical, right? And the ugliness is something that we are all capable of, individually and collectively. And the warning that whether we are on our high horse or whether we are that person down the banks of the river, no matter where we are in our position emotionally right now, that we are all capable of doing ugly things. And we have a responsibility individually and collectively as a community to hold each other accountable for that, to have some flexibility in terms of how we forgive people, that there is a value in forgiving people for making mistakes, whether they are a leader in our community or whether they are the man down the street. It doesn't matter who. There is a need for flexibility in the system. And I think this is something that we are going to continue to be seeing playing out in our country. There are going to be, I think, stronger and stronger feelings of hunkering down to positions, whether that is you believe that we should be opening up the doors and getting out of our houses, whether we should be staying firm inside and looking at the states and looking at the governors and looking at our leaders as either supporting our position and having no sense of understanding of the other's position, whatever it may be. As you can see, there is a theme that comes through many of these stories about how we are supposed to interpret and understand our relationship with those who are different from us. And we are living in a country right now and at a very unique time where we are going to be pulled, as we already have for the last few years, but I think we're going to continue to see that. How are we understanding what ugliness looks like? How are we willing to have some flexibility? Where do we draw the line and where we are a cedar? And how do we hold ourselves and hold a community accountable for actions? So a lot of things coming out of this story. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. We will be back next week for another story. And as you have on your short source sheet, you have my email. Feel free to reach out at any time, and look forward to learning with all of you again in the future. I really appreciate you taking the time in the middle of the day to come learn with me and learning with the community. So have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks so much.